tree houses. For many, they are a symbol of childhood, joy, and freedom. But what happens when this refuge becomes the stage for something terrifying? Today, we're diving into 4 real-life stories that took place in tree houses, each one more chilling than the last. Get ready, because these tales will make you think twice before climbing into one. And of course, if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps us bring more terrifying content like this to you. When I was around 9 or 10 years old, my family moved from the rural quiet of Pennsylvania to an affluent neighborhood in Brookmont, Maryland. It wasn't a gradual change. It was abrupt, like waking up in someone else's life. One month we were living in a small, crumbling house in a struggling neighborhood, and the next, we were unpacking in a sprawling suburban home with a backyard that could double as a playground. For a socially awkward kid like me, it was a strange but welcome shift. I didn't have many or really any friends to leave behind, so I adjusted quickly. The backyard became my escape. It was enormous, full of winding hedges that made for perfect hiding spots during games. But the crown jewel was a magnificent treehouse nestled at the far edge of the property. Calling it a treehouse feels like an insult. This thing was massive. More like a wooden fortress suspended in the arms of half a dozen tall trees. It had 3 levels, proper stairs, and enough space to feel like a second home. It was clearly built by someone who knew what they were doing, and my siblings and I were in awe. For weeks, it became our playground, our castle, our pirate ship. But like most things, my older brothers grew bored of it, retreating to their teenage pursuits, while I continued climbing up there alone. One afternoon, as I stepped into the treehouse, something unusual caught my eye. In the far corner of the first level, there was a folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. Curious, I opened it. Written in neat, looping handwriting were the words, "Hello, I'm the Marshmallow Man. It's nice to meet you. What's your name?" At that moment, I felt like the luckiest kid in the world. My brothers had to be behind it, I thought. Maybe this was their way of coaxing me back into their games. Determined to play along, I grabbed a marker from the stash we kept in the treehouse and scribbled my name on the back of the note. I placed it exactly where I had found the first one, hoping they'd find it and continue the game. Over the next few days, more notes appeared, always written in that same neat handwriting. At first, they were playful and innocent, just like my brothers. Things like, "Do you like the treehouse? It's my favorite spot too." Or, "What's your favorite snack?" The simplicity of it made me happy, and I started looking forward to the daily ritual of finding the notes. But then the tone of the notes began to shift. Instead of playful questions, they became oddly specific, almost invasive. Things like, "What time do you usually come here?" Or, "Which window is your bedroom?" I still thought it was my brothers, though the questions didn't sound like anything they'd ever ask. They were older, and usually too busy making fun of me to come up with something this elaborate. But then there was one note I'll never forget. It said, "What do your pajamas smell like?" I remember holding the paper, my stomach twisting in confusion and fear. This wasn't funny anymore. That evening, I confronted my brothers, shoving the notes at them and demanding to know which one of them was behind it. They laughed at me. Not just the kind of laugh that comes with teasing, but genuine, confused laughter. They swore up and down that they hadn't written any of the notes and called me crazy for even thinking so. When I broke into tears, they rolled their eyes and walked away. Frustrated and desperate for answers, I decided to catch them in the act. That night, I stayed awake in my room, barely able to sleep as I devised a plan. The next day, I climbed up into the treehouse and waited for whoever, or whatever, was leaving the notes. Hours passed, and nothing happened. By sunset, I gave up, feeling like an idiot. Then, around midnight, I woke up to a tapping sound on my bedroom window. I froze in place, my heart thundering in my chest. Slowly, I turned to face the window, my breath hitching as I tried to muster the courage to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. Marshmallows, Dozens of them were taped to the glass in random patterns. I wanted to believe it was my brothers. It had to be them, right? But the fear in my gut told me otherwise. I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next night, I stayed awake again, ready to confront whoever was doing this. I kept my room dark and positioned myself by the window, trying to act as though I was asleep. Around the same time as before, the tapping started again. This time, I pulled the curtains open in one quick motion, ready to catch them. What I saw wasn't my brothers. It wasn't anyone I knew. A man stood outside my window, his face inches from the glass. His skin was pale and clammy looking, his hair thin and wiry. His eyes were a sickly yellow, his teeth jagged and rotting. He smiled at me, a grin so wide it looked like it might split his face in two. I screamed louder than I ever had in my life. My parents came running, bursting into my room just as the man vanished into the darkness. The police were called, and they searched the property for hours, but found no sign of him. They even checked the treehouse and the woods beyond our backyard, but it was like he had disappeared into thin air. After that night, I refused to go near the treehouse again. My parents tried to assure me it was safe, but they didn't need to. I had no intention of ever setting foot in it. Years later, I still think about that man, who he was, what he wanted, and why he chose me. Every time I visit my parents, I catch myself glancing at the treehouse. It's still there, looming at the edge of the property, like a dark reminder of that terrifying chapter in my life. The Marshmallow Man hasn't returned, but his memory lingers. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see that twisted grin, staring back at me from the other side of the glass. When my son Luke was 8 years old, he was full of energy and curiosity, the kind of kid who couldn't sit still for long. At the time, I was a carpenter by trade, always good with my hands and eager to tackle any project that would bring a smile to my family's faces. One summer, I decided to build a treehouse for Luke in our backyard. But I didn't want it to be just any treehouse. I wanted it to be special, something he'd remember forever. It wasn't a quick weekend job. I poured weeks of effort into it, crafting sturdy walls, a proper roof, and a set of wooden stairs that wound up into the branches of a massive oak tree. By the time it was done, it wasn't just a treehouse. It was an escape, a fortress. Luke adored it. And despite my wife Christy's initial concerns about it being too high off the ground, she eventually came around when she saw how much joy it brought him. Our house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, bordering a dense forest. It was peaceful and private, the kind of place where you could hear birds singing and leaves rustling in the breeze. The treehouse stood at the edge of the backyard, right where the lawn gave way to the woods. From our bedroom window, I had a perfect view of the stairs leading up to it. I liked knowing I could keep an eye on Luke when he was up there. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. Luke would spend hours in the treehouse, playing make-believe and creating stories in his head. But after a few weeks, he started talking about someone named Jake. "Jake doesn't like to come inside," he said one evening at dinner. "Who's Jake?" I asked, assuming it was one of the neighborhood kids. "He's my friend," Luke replied with a smile. "He likes the treehouse." It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, but something about this struck me as odd. Luke wasn't the kind of child who created imaginary companions. He had always been more interested in exploring or building things. Still, I didn't think much of it. Kids are kids, I thought. But then things started getting strange. Luke began spending more and more time in the treehouse. He stopped bringing toys or books up with him and would sit there for hours, seemingly doing nothing. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said, "Jake doesn't like when I bring stuff. He says we don't need it." Christy was growing uneasy. "It's one thing to have an imaginary friend," she said, "but this feels different. Like he's obsessed." I agreed it was odd, but I didn't want to stifle Luke's creativity. Still, my curiosity got the better of me. One evening, I climbed up to the treehouse while Luke was asleep, just to see if there was anything unusual. What I found made my stomach churn. The floor was scattered with crumpled papers, old snack wrappers, and dirty plates. There were small muddy shoes, ones I didn't recognize, piled in a corner, along with mismatched socks. And on the walls, drawn in pencil, were crude sketches of animals: a bear, a fox, and a deer. But the one that stood out the most was a grotesque spider with a sagging, human-like face. I climbed down and confronted Luke the next day. "Where did all that stuff in the treehouse come from?" I asked. "Jake brought it," he said, his tone flat. "He needs it to feel comfortable." "And the shoes?" I pressed, my voice sharper than I intended. "Whose are those?" "They're Jake's," Luke replied matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "He forgets his stuff a lot." That was the last straw. I told Luke he wasn't allowed to play in the treehouse anymore. He cried and begged, but I held firm. I didn't know where he had gotten all that junk or why he was lying about it, but it wasn't safe for him to be out there alone anymore. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, and Christy had already gone to bed. I was closing up the house when I glanced out the window and saw movement near the treehouse. At first I thought it was Luke sneaking out defying my rules, but then I saw him. A boy, frail and sickly looking, was climbing down the steps of the treehouse. It wasn't Luke. I rushed outside, shouting for the boy to stop. As soon as I opened the door, he bolted into the woods. I chased him, but he was unnaturally fast, disappearing into the darkness in seconds. My heart pounded as I stood at the edge of the forest, listening to the silence pressing in around me. We called the police, who combed the woods for hours, but found nothing. No signs of the boy, no signs of anyone living out there. The next day, they questioned Luke. What he told them chilled me to the core. "Jake lives in the forest with his friends," Luke said. "He told me he was magical and wanted me to come live with him. He said I'd never have to go to school or do chores. But I said no, and he got mad. He makes these loud, angry noises when he's upset." Christy was convinced Jake wasn't real, that Luke had created this elaborate story to explain something he didn't understand. But I wasn't so sure. The boy I saw wasn't a figment of anyone's imagination. He was real, and he was dangerous. We haven't seen Jake since that night, but the treehouse still stands, a silent reminder of how close we came to losing our son. Christy still believes it was just a disturbed boy wandering the woods, but I can't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. Whether Jake was a child of flesh and blood or something far more sinister, I'll never know. But sometimes, late at night, I catch myself staring out the window, watching the treehouse, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. It happened on a crisp October night, during my fall break from college. I was back home in Delaware, staying with my parents in the quiet suburb where I grew up. Coming home was always a bittersweet experience. I loved seeing my parents, but their strict, traditional ways made me feel suffocated. One of their most unshakable rules? Absolutely no smoking. But I had a solution. The old treehouse. That rickety old thing had been my childhood haven, a place I could escape to when I needed solitude. Even now, though it was weathered and creaky, it stood tall in the backyard, partially hidden by thick tree branches. From up there, I could see everything: the street, the house, the yard, but no one could see me unless they knew exactly where to look. It was perfect. That Saturday night, my parents were out at some charity banquet, which meant I had the house, and the treehouse, to myself. Armed with my stash, I climbed up into the structure as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was chilly, the kind that made your breath fog up in the dark, and the silence was comforting, a familiar blanket wrapping me in nostalgia. I settled in, taking in the view as I relaxed. The lights from nearby houses twinkled faintly in the distance. For a while it was peaceful, just me, the cool air, and the memories of simpler times. But that peace shattered when a light flicked on inside my house. I froze. My parents weren't supposed to be home for hours. My stomach churned as a dozen thoughts raced through my mind. Maybe they'd forgotten something and come back early, or maybe it wasn't them at all. That's when I saw movement in the yard. 3 figures, all dressed in dark hooded clothes, were circling the property, moving quickly but cautiously. My pulse quickened as the realization hit me. They were burglars. One of them darted to the front door and started fiddling with it while the others hovered nearby. Moments later, the door creaked open, and a 4th figure appeared in the doorway, motioning for the others to enter. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. I was frozen, watching helplessly from above as they slipped inside. Part of me wanted to rush down and confront them, but another part, the logical part, knew that was a terrible idea. Instead, I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm and steady as I whispered my address and explained what was happening. "Stay where you are," she said. "Officers are on their way." As I ended the call, I caught movement below me. One of the intruders had come back outside and was pacing the yard. My breath hitched as his head turned toward the treehouse. He paused, staring into the darkness, and I realized with horror that the faint glow from my phone screen had given away my position. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice sharp and angry. I ducked down, heart hammering in my chest. I prayed he hadn't really seen me, but my hopes were dashed when I heard footsteps approaching the base of the tree. I peeked through a crack in the floorboards and saw him starting to climb the wooden slats leading up to the treehouse. I panicked. I had nothing to defend myself except the glass bong I'd brought with me. Without thinking, I grabbed it and waited until his head popped up into view. Then, with every ounce of strength I could muster, I hurled it at him. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the night as the bong struck him square in the forehead. He let out a guttural curse and lost his grip, tumbling back to the ground. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to hear him yell something to the others before he scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the house. Seconds later, the other 3 intruders came running out the front door. They disappeared into the shadows of the street just as the sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashed across the yard, and I felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that I thought I might collapse. When the police arrived, I climbed down from the treehouse, my legs wobbling like jelly. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words were a tangled mess. The officers were kind, though, and reassured me that I'd done the right thing by calling them. My parents arrived home shortly after, their faces pale as the officers filled them in. "They knew we'd be out," one of the officers said. "This was planned." That comment haunted me. The idea that someone had been watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, made my skin crawl. The police didn't find a getaway vehicle or much evidence to identify the intruders, but they promised to keep investigating. Since that night, I haven't been able to sleep soundly. I keep replaying the image of that man climbing toward me, his hands gripping the wooden planks with grim determination. I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't thrown that bomb, or if the police had taken just a few minutes longer to arrive. I'm back at school now, trying to put the incident behind me, but it lingers like a shadow. And every time my parents call, I find myself asking the same question. Everything's okay at the house, right? I hope it stays that way. When I was 12 years old, my parents and I lived in a quaint suburban home in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't flashy or extravagant, but it had a charm that made it feel like a safe haven. One of my favorite parts of that house was the tree house in our backyard. It wasn't the kind of rickety, thrown-together platform most kids had. The previous owner had built it for their children, and it was solid, with a proper roof and even windows. For my older brother Kyle and me, it was a little sanctuary. But by the time I turned 12, the treehouse had lost its appeal. I was too old to play pirates or make-believe, and it mostly sat unused. I had other things to focus on: school, video games, and being a general pain to my parents. At that age, I was the definition of a rebellious preteen. I mouthed off, got into trouble at school, and spent more time than I should have grounded. One weekend, after a particularly heated argument with my dad, I decided I wasn't going to stay in the house that night. If they were going to ground me, I'd ground myself in the treehouse. I grabbed a couple of blankets, my pillow, and my Nintendo DS, my lifeline during those days, and climbed up into the old wooden structure, determined to spend the night there. It wasn't the first time I'd done it, and my parents didn't seem to care much as long as I stayed on the property. I spent hours playing Animal Crossing, the glow of the DS screen illuminating the inside of the treehouse as the sounds of the night surrounded me. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl drifted through the air. It was peaceful until it wasn't. Somewhere in the haze of sleepiness, I thought I heard my name, faint at first, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. Tommy? I froze, my fingers hovering over the buttons of my DS. The voice was low and raspy, distinctly male. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was my dad coming to check on me, or to yell at me again. But as I sat there, clutching the DS like a lifeline, the voice came again, clearer this time. Tommy, are you up there? My heart began to pound. That wasn't my dad's voice. It was deeper, rougher, and completely unfamiliar. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The treehouse creaked as if the weight of the wind pressed against it, and I told myself that maybe, just maybe, I was imagining things. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden ladder. Creak, creak. Someone was climbing up. Panic gripped me. I scrambled to the far corner of the treehouse, clutching the blanket to my chest as if it could shield me from whatever was coming. The ladder groaned under the weight of someone heavy. My breath caught in my throat as I saw a shadow rise through the small opening in the floor. A head appeared, silhouetted by the faint moonlight. I couldn't make out the features, but I could tell it was a man, a large man with a square jaw and broad shoulders. He paused, his head swiveling slowly, as if scanning the interior. Then he spoke again. There you are. His voice was calm, almost friendly, but there was something off about it, something that sent shivers racing down my spine. I wanted to scream, but fear held my voice hostage. Instead, I did the only thing I could think of. I scrambled to one of the small windows and shouted at the top of my lungs. Dad, Mom, help. The man didn't move. He just stared at me, his head tilted slightly, as if he were curious. The seconds dragged on like hours until, finally, I heard the sound of my parents' bedroom window sliding open. Light spilled into the yard as my dad's voice boomed through the night. Tommy? What's going on? The man's head snapped toward the house. For a moment, he was completely still, and then, without a word, he climbed back down the ladder and disappeared into the darkness of the yard. By the time my dad reached the treehouse, he was gone. I was hysterical, barely able to form coherent sentences as I tried to explain what had happened. My dad didn't waste any time. He called the police, who arrived within minutes and combed the area. They checked every inch of the backyard, the treehouse, and even the neighboring properties, but there was no sign of the man. It was like he had vanished into thin air. The next day, the police came back to take my statement. I described everything, the voice, the shadow, the way he climbed up the ladder. But there wasn't much they could do with the vague description I'd given them. They chalked it up to a possible prowler and warned us to keep the doors and windows locked at night. For years, I couldn't step foot in that treehouse again. Every time I looked at it, I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach, a lingering dread that made me relive that night. Even now, as an adult, I can't help but wonder who that man was and what he wanted. But the thing that haunts me the most, he knew my name,